Hello, this is Back Garden Reads, and this is my review for the Penguin's Classics edition of Clark Ashton Smith's The Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies. To give some background to this, is that this is a Californian author who was born in the early 20th century, right? And he was an author that was good friends with the likes of Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. There's a lot of, like on the back of here, you can see like different things, like that of like people going, oh yeah, oh that's really cool, oh yeah, of like take one of like one by Ray Bradbury and by Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber is the author to the books of the Fafford and the Grey Mouser. I really like these stories. I remember I was doing some kind of garden work for my uncle and my aunt and I was just like kind of bored, and I just wanted to listen to something while I worked, so I just found some, and I didn't want to listen to music, so I just looked for audiobooks, right? And I just happened to stumble upon the Dark Eidolon audio book, or just the read out loud, right? And I remember reading, like listening to it, and thinking, oh, that sounds really interesting and cool. And one thing that you find that with his books, it feels sort of mystical in a way. Because, for one, he has very maximal writing, in that he really is like big sentences, using these interesting sorts of words that you don't normally see in the English language, or that is just commonly used at all. But it's still very fantastic. Like, I'm not sure if it's an actual word, and I might be, oh yeah, phantasmagorical. Yeah, phantasmagorical. Well, that's like the first time I've ever heard like such a strange word, and it's so interesting. I remember going through almost his entire life, almost all the audio recordings of all his stories. Now, you can find quite a few of the recordings from done by Horror Babble. From my understanding, they do more of the horror and sci-fi stories rather than the fantasy ones, or rather the ones that can be seen as more fantastical. One thing of note about Clark Ashton Smith's stories is that fantastical and imaginative quality that is in ways far different to how the other fantasies of the day were, right? Like sometimes you'd have it like a strange mix of almost science fiction and fantasy, where there's like one called like The Daughter Saturn, in which the sorcerer Ivan and the Inquisitor like go to this planet called Psychronosh, which is Saturn. And Saturn is this whole fantastic world full of these weird sorts of aliens. Also this, like the home of like the Lovecraftian god Sothakwa, which is actually one thing that I forgot to mention, is that his main contribution to the Cthulhu mythos, the god Sothakwa, you know, the squat, toad-like, bat, slothful sort of god. And like one thing that I find is interesting about his stories is that some of them have sometimes this little bit of humor to the stories that is very unlike all the other sorts of Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos sort of thing. I like really enjoy the Dark Eidolon. It's based on this sort of super future, of a decaying Earth. I'll read the first paragraph for you, because I think I can do that. On Zafik, the last continent of Earth, The sun no longer shone with the whiteness of its prime, but was dim and tarnished as if with a vapor of blood. New stars without number had declared themselves in the heavens, and the shadows of the infinite had fallen closer. And out of the shadows the older gods had returned to man, the gods forgotten since Hyperborea, since Mu and Poseidonus, bearing other names but the same attributes. And the elder demons also returned, battening mightily on the fumes of evil sacrifice and fostering again the primordial sorceries. One thing that is you have to keep in mind with this, a lot of the writers of the time, is that there was this belief of these lost sort of continents, somewhat like Atlantis. One of them being Hyperborea, which is the extreme kind of hidden north, which I believe it has some other more modern day negative connotations to it. I don't know. And then there's also Mu, which is another sort of mythical continent, and I believe it's Mu is is Atlantic. I believe it's in the Atlantic. I might be completely wrong about it, but it's these fictionalized sort of continent. It's known as fiction, but at the time it was a very sort of like, oh, well, maybe it was actually real. Now, Poseidonus is completely fiction. It is of his own making. And some of these mentions of Hyperborea, Mu, and Poseidonus are actually some settings in which he sets other stories. These stories are also pretty interesting in itself. One thing with the Dark Eidolon, it really kind of sets this sort of evil sorcerer archetype. It does it much more so, establishes it much better, this evil sorcerer archetype, than, say, anything that Robert E. Howard made, right? With his Conan the Barbarian stories. Now, the thing is that, and because you get this sort of this mysterious evil, like the evil sorcerer, like necromancer sorcerer, with like the long white beard and all that, you could say that a lot of that is attributed to the Dark Eidolon. And just for that alone, it can be very interesting to read. There are other stories in this that I also just find interesting. And you can tell because I actually like kind of note them down. But I do this because I actually want to just quickly flip to them and read them. Now, one thing about this book in particular is that it is a combination of only maybe a few of his stories, because he wrote quite a few stories, and then some prose poems, which is like, you could say, flash fiction. That's what, it's like these really short 1 to 2 page stories. And then there's also like poetry that's sort like based on the settings and the worlds, which is again pretty interesting. But yeah, like, while Dark Eidolon is a very interesting read, and just to understand the whole dark sorcerer archetype, I would just say, just go with that. He also did like several other things, of some stories set on sort of distant future, or not so distant from our own period of time, where we're like traveling Mars, and various things that we can find on Mars that are semi-horrific and otherworldly and stuff like that, which is, I remember this one story of like these, where they open this vault, and inside it's just these horrible like creatures that just latch onto people, and which in a way I would say that it actually reminds me a lot of the face huggers, from Aliens and whatnot, in that they act in almost a similar way, but of course the story predated the film. In some ways it does give you the idea that, oh, maybe someone when write that may have influenced a little bit of that strange, like the face hugger. That can be a bit of a wishful thinking, because I'd say one of the biggest problems with Clark Ashton Smith is that he is, of like so many of the pulp era authors, he's probably the least republished, or the least talked about, you could say. Which is generally a shame, because again, he has this sort of imagination that's very different to most of his contemporaries, different to H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and just a lot of the people in his era, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's like, and there's this sort of almost poetic nature to his writing. One of the biggest problems with this sort of writing is that it can be a bit like, if you're trying to read it, you can find a lot of words that are like, oh, what, I'm not sure what that means, I would say I'm most disappointed about this, that there's not as many, there's not that many books that are, or short story collection, Clark Ashton Smith, that I know of. Because there are certain stories that I really love, that I found on YouTube, which you can easily access for free, which, you're probably already on YouTube, unless you've downloaded this video or whatever. Just type in Clark Ashton Smith and get most of his short stories that way. Yeah. Now, it's just generally a well worth read, especially if you want to understanding of the pulp era fiction, the pulp magazines, and you want to go into that sort of classical era. And for that, I would totally recommend this. One other thing is that, like, this illustration is actually done by Clark Ashton Smith, which is pretty cool. Like, he did it later in life, and yeah, it's pretty interesting. It gives this sort of medieval sort of vibe to it, which is, I actually quite appreciate that. Yeah, I'd totally recommend it. And that was my review for Clark Ashton Smith, the Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies by, for the Penguin Classics.